Hello, it's Neal Romanek, and I am here for the very first Feed Forum webinar. Welcome. Today we are going to be looking at latency, what it is, why it's important, and why it may actually be a wider and more interesting topic than you might first think. We've got Ian Hamilton, who's the CTO of Signiant, with us, and James Varndell, who's a Senior Director of Product Management at Bitmovin. And these two brilliant guys from great technology companies are going to set us straight about what latency is. Latency is usually thought of, I guess, as being the time between when video is sent out, when it's broadcast, and the time it gets to the place it needs to go, whether that's audience or whatever it is. But the question maybe is a bit bigger, and about making sure that content gets to where you want it to be, exactly when you want it to be there. Guys, let's start, I guess, by saying, what is latency? If I just kind of come to the video space and live streaming and broadcast, what is latency and why should I care? James, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on the webinar today. I think this is a really interesting and relevant topic right now. I think when we think about latency, the context is typically around live events that are happening in the real world, and viewers at home, consumers at home who want to engage with that live event, could be watching it, could be interacting with it. Primarily, I think at the moment we see that a lot around live sports. So either live sports matches or other kind of time sensitive activities that are happening around like a live sports event. Could be commentary shows, those kind of things. So typically, I think when we're thinking about latency, it's the time between the event happening in the real world and then the viewer seeing either the event or something related to the event, some content related to the event on their screen. So I think probably an obvious thing to think is why is that important? As a sports kind of fan myself, I think obviously I want to see the goal scored by my team as close to when it happens as possible. That's just something that is desirable naturally as a sports fan or a fan of live events. But I think when it comes to video, it's really important to think about what viewers might be doing alongside the event. So they might be messaging with their friends. They might have a second screen device open where they're looking at text updates around the game or some commentary around the game, or they're on Instagram watching, with their favorite other fans, for example, that they're following, or influencers, right? And so I think the challenge is if you as a viewer are much further behind the event than what's happening in the stadium, or what other people are seeing, it can degrade those other experiences. Like if one of my friends tells me that a goal was scored before I see it on my screen, I can't engage in the conversation in the same way as if we see it all at the same time. Some of that excitement is reduced. I think probably from the side of the streaming services, though, there's potentially also an opportunity maybe to offer low latency solutions as a feature, like of a premium subscription package, pay a bit more, get a shorter latency, for example. I think that's what we think of when we talk about latency, and maybe I'm sure we'll get into some of the infrastructure implications of that.
Ian, do you have
Yeah,
anything to add?
I think if we broaden out the definition of latency a bit, it's really the time between cause and effect. And obviously everything related to live sports and broadcasts that James talked about is 100% true, but there's also process latency. So if I'm running a live sporting event and I've got pre-recorded content that I'm inserting in that live sporting event, or I'm recording 10 camera angles and I want to keep all of those 10 camera angles, even though only one of those making it to the broadcast feed, the timeliness of that content that you're going to insert in the feed getting to wherever you're going to insert it from needs to be there. And as well, as quickly as you can get those live recordings out of wherever you're recording them, perhaps in a broadcast truck of some sort, the better off you're going to be. So Signiant tends to be live adjacent, I would say, in that we're moving content in that gets inserted in the live feed, and we're taking the live feeds and we're archiving them somewhere afterwards. And, latency impacts us at many different levels. One is just the actual network protocols and how well they perform when you've got a lot of bandwidth and a long distance between the two locations. And can you actually use that available bandwidth? And we could certainly get into some of that if you think that would be interesting to the audience. But more so process latency. Like, you don't want to wait until you have an entire recording before you start transferring that if you want to minimize the time that recording is useful to someone somewhere else in a post-processing or a review capacity of some sort.
So I guess also that brings up the question of like, where is, how do we reduce, or maybe again, it's not reduce. It's not like that, compressing it is automatically better, but it's like, I guess, getting a handle and getting control of latency maybe is a better way of putting it. What do you need to be doing to make sure that you have a handle on and knowing kind of what your latency is going to be and kind of what that is in the process? Are there like things that you need to be thinking about in terms of the entire workflow and how you're building a workflow? Or is it really just a matter of like, well, it's just the stuff at the end and how fast it spits it out? And are there whole infrastructure things that you need to be thinking about with controlling latency?
Well, I mean, latency comes from primarily three places. One is fundamentally the speed of light. So I can't see things happening on the sun until 8 minutes later because it takes light 8 minutes to come from the sun to Earth. But does that matter? I mean, that doesn't expect user experience. I look at the sun, hopefully through some sort of filter that doesn't burn my eyes out, and it looks like the sun. It's just behaving. It's not an issue. It's really when there is that interactivity and there's other things that you're trying to correlate with that becomes a problem. So this fundamental speed of light is ultimately what you can't do better than. But then there's also buffering latency. So are you encoding a pixel at a time? Are you encoding a scan line at a time? Are you encoding a frame at a time? Are you encoding a group of frames, a group of pictures at a time? That impacts how much information you have to have. So there's buffering delay, which increases latency, and then switching latency, which is probably the most problematic of all when you're going over an IP network, because not only can congestion and other factors delay how long it takes information to make its way through that network, and also there can also be a significant amount of jitter, which is variance in latency as that information moves over that network. And a predictable latency is a lot easier to deal with than a latency which is bouncing all over the place. So it's, ultimately, I know there's a lot of theoretical stuff in there, but it's ultimately about how do you deliver the best user experience. And, having things happen as close to real time as possible isn't necessarily the best user experience, especially, for the scenario that James mentioned earlier, like if I'm listening to a radio broadcast of a game while I'm watching it over some sort of streaming service, they're going to be out of sync. And I'm going to hear things happening on the radio broadcast before I see them happening on the stream. And therefore, it would probably be better to actually have more latency in the radio broadcast to improve my user experience than to, just because fundamentally it's expensive to reduce the latency in the streaming because of all of those encoding, switching, speed of light issues that I mentioned. So, it's more about managing latency than it is about reducing latency to the absolute minimum.
Yeah, I really concur with that. We've invested a fair bit of time and have seen a lot of interesting conversation around the notion of setting a target latency, which is not necessarily reducing the latency to the absolute minimum, but it's trying to keep every viewer at the same latency target. Doesn't necessarily mean a lowest common denominator, for example, but it could be saying, okay, well, I could push everybody to 5-second latency, but some viewers may end up on 5 seconds, some may end up on 10 seconds or more. That may actually be suboptimal. And actually what I want to do is say, okay, well, I'm going to try and aim for maybe 10 seconds for everybody or 12 seconds for everybody. And then I can start to look at what other experiences I can provide around that, which to Ian's point, then I'm working with a predictable latency, and so I can do better things.
So can you control that latency for various audiences? Like can I mean, as you were saying, like if I have a Premier subscription to something low latency for whatever, I want to make sure I see the goal 10 seconds before everybody else. Um, or in various,
Right.
I mean,
It could be based on your entitlement, for example.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so as you load the app and load the video player, there's an entitlement check to determine what subscription tier you've subscribed to. Even that can actually go down, we see, to like the device level and network level. So, doing some initial checks on what type of device are you running. Are you running a really old kind of Android phone, for example, which might be quite challenging to deliver a low latency stream to, or are you running like the latest Android phone or latest iPhone, for example, which it may cope quite better? And then also, what is your network conditions kind of like? I'm coming at it from a kind of video player perspective, so on the actual consumer device. But those are some of the things that can be checked prior to actually serving the stream to you, so that you get either the lowest latency possible if that's your motivation and that's what you're paying for as part of your subscription, or otherwise you get a standard latency but you get a good experience. I think probably generally among streaming services that we work with, I would say most are prioritizing low buffering and low error rates ahead of having the absolute lowest latency. So they may in some cases slightly increase the latency for some viewers if they predict that going to the lowest possible latency would risk this viewer getting buffering, maybe because their network is not quite as fast or has some latency built into it, which others don't, or that the device itself would struggle to actually kind of process and keep up with the lowest possible latency. So they'll increase it slightly because they're optimizing for lower buffering and lower error rates, which I think for viewers is more frustrating than seeing the event maybe 3-4 seconds later than they possibly could do if there was a risk then of buffering and errors. Hopefully that makes sense.
That is, I guess I could see if there was something that's like a hyper local event that might be the fact that you can do it, there's the lowest latency possible, that might that might help create a sense of community, or some kind of benefit for the audience. I'm thinking in terms of whenever there's been a big, I live in London, whenever there's big royal event, there's often a flyby of like the red arrows or whatever, and I'm like going to go outside to see it, and it's already happened. So like, they've already gone past by the time the TV tells me it's started. But that thing of like, if you're trying to create community around something, that might be something you could really focus on.
Well, another place where low latency is really important is when there's interactivity. So imagine in this conversation, if every time you asked a question, it was 1, 2, 3, I can now answer that question because it's finally got to me. That would not work, and fundamentally because you're not filling the available bandwidth you have. And when you get down to the nitty-gritty network layers, you have the same sorts of problems where when you're trying to guarantee bit accuracy of information flowing over a network, there's a lot of back and forth acknowledgement. Hi, Ian, how are you? 1, 2, 3. I'm fine. How are you? 1, 2, 3. Fine. You have dead space in that conversation. And one of the things that Signiant has traditionally done has made sure that with those network protocols all the way up the stack, we can take advantage of every single bit of bandwidth that's available. But process latency is equally important. I mean, you need to, there's no point in making sure that you can get 100 gigabytes across the network in 10 seconds if at the other end there's a delay of half an hour before it's used for anything. So there's all sorts of important aspects of process latency that you really need to address, not strictly related to live broadcasts, other than things like getting pre-recorded content into a truck or getting recorded content out of the truck. But in general, in the media industry, whenever you're trying to get information from one place to another, process latency can have a real business impact, time to value, time to money. And anytime you can take steps out by pipelining, overlapping, better integrating systems, there's usually a value there.
So it is like that. I mean, we still are almost trying to, maybe we're still stuck on that idea of like there's a mast on a hill and it's sending out everything at the speed of light to everybody's antenna on top of their house. And sort of trying to duplicate that in a way. But of course, in an OTT world, or, in the sort of multi-platform world, I have my live broadcast, but I also want to make sure that these socials and these clips drop at certain times, and I'm kind of orchestrating a whole set of content deliveries for my audience that have that may have a very long timeline, and that sort of that initial broadcast is just one small part of it.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think there are multiple different like use cases where applying the technology in the appropriate way kind of makes most sense. So you could have somebody, let's say there's a football match happening, right? For example, in the Premier League, you could have one viewer who is sat at home, maybe they're gambling or betting on the match while it's happening. To them, having a very low latency stream might be quite important and quite valuable for how they're experiencing the match. Maybe they're placing a bet during the match. If they have a 30-second delay, there's they're obviously a bit behind. It's not so dynamic. That experience isn't quite as good. But equally, you could have this another individual who's keeping track of the same match, but they're out. It's Saturday lunchtime. They're out dropping their kids off. They're doing the shopping or whatever. They still want to keep in touch with the match, but they're not watching a live stream. It doesn't need to be, 2-second latency, 5 seconds latency, what have you. But if there's a goal, they maybe want to see a clip of that quite soon after it happens. Maybe they get a text update from their team. Hey, we've scored a goal. They may want to then see a clip of that goal, a highlight clip, quite quickly in the supermarket or wherever they happen to be. So applying, in one case, somebody watching the live match betting on it at the same time, they may benefit from a very low latency stream. Somebody who's out doing their weekend chores but wants to watch a clip of the game, they're not live streaming it, but still getting that content to them very quickly can be quite important.
Yeah, and in the context of OTT, the user experience is driven by different factors. It's really how quickly does a stream start playing for social or OTT is actually far more important than how high quality is the clip. So you'll notice that a lot of OTTs will actually start the stream at a lower bandwidth, and then as they detect that they can feed information to you more quickly, your picture quality or your audio quality will get better with variable bit rate encoding. So it really is, what are you optimizing for? What experience are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for visual continuity? Like, do you not want buffers? Or are you optimizing for highest possible picture quality? Are you optimizing for bit accuracy? And there's all sorts of different strategies that can be applied to each of those different user experience or business outcome values, depending on what's most important to you.
And then what about that? So after that moment that it arrives, or that the signal arrives, or the stream arrives at the viewer gets to see it, viewer's happy, the viewer's team has won. There's the sort of the high adrenaline live element of the broadcast, but then after that there is a whole, we talked a little bit about that, but this kind of whole long tail of what's going to happen to that content. How is that content moved around to other stakeholders? And obviously this is something that Signiant is involved in. What do I need to be thinking about in terms of like having made the touchdown and completed the job, then what happens?
So that ties back to process latency. So if you're sending all of the feeds from all of the cameras in the stadium out, you're recording all of these different cameras, and you have social media teams for different players who may be on different feeds at different points in time, who are trying to do clips and post them on social media. The amount of time it takes for that camera footage to be available to them, for them to be able to clip it, and for them to be able to post it on social media has a direct impact on their ability to drive revenue from that. 2 years later, it's not going to be nearly as relevant as 3 minutes after the goal was scored or 30 seconds after the goal was scored. So your question highlights perfectly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about process latency and how it even applies to live broadcasts, in that if you can make a recording of a camera angle that may not be actually part of what is being broadcast to the mass audience available to a specialized team to be clipping from, or even the main broadcast available to a social media team to be clipping from, there's huge value in that, and drive better business outcomes.
So you don't want people sitting around. I mean, maybe you want people sitting around after the game, but you want it to be a choice, not because people are waiting for something and there's nothing
Yeah,
better to do.
I guess what I'm saying is you do want, of course, you want to engage with people as long as you can, but people are more likely to engage the closer to the time that it actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. Um, so are there any, I mean, I know that, technology is moving along quite rapidly and being able to kind of reduce latency and being able to deliver things in different ways. Are there technological solutions that really are best for getting control of latency and delivering low latency? Or is it just a bit of, maybe it's a little bit of apples, a little bit of oranges? Are there principles that we like, you should be doing this?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely technological solutions, but make no mistake, your point about a mast on a hill is the best way to get content to a bunch of people, a very large audience, very quickly with very low latency. So, um, you know, that the old technology is the best for that. The thing is, it's not good for niche casting, for lots of other things that people want to do. And in the production process, as we talked about, going back to this social media clipping example, the content from a camera is coming in some format like XD-Cam or something that you need specialized desktop software to process. So imagine if you had technology that as soon as that landed, anybody on a web browser anywhere in the world could play that content from that web browser without loading any special plugins. They could jump around in that stream without without incurring a latency delay of having to have like the entire thing encoded and cranked through before they can deal with it, and could pull little segments out for their job of clipping for social media. That technology radically changes the latency in the process latency and the ultimate business outcome in that scenario. But there's technologies for all sorts of other scenarios that can address latency. In particular, the live streaming scenario. There's it's really a cost trade-off. But what are you optimizing for in the overall equation?
Yeah, I can elaborate a little bit on the live streaming side. I think probably where we're seeing um, the sweet spot at the moment, particularly for kind of large scale big sports events, uh, Super Bowl streaming or World Cup or Olympics or those major sports events, would be within low latency dash or low latency HLS. I think it offers good compatibility across different video players, across different devices. It's offering you a latency typically of 5 to 10 seconds in our experience in the real world. There are other technologies that can go to a lower latency, like ultra low latency WebRTC technologies, probably what we're using today to record this webinar, for example. That can reach very low latencies, 2 seconds or less, for example. But to Ian's point, there's a massive cost implication there. It can also be difficult to scale. It's not really proven with a large number of viewers, the type of numbers that you would expect to see in globally relevant live events. So I think low latency dash and low latency HLS is what we're seeing the most deployment of for low latency streaming. I think also sort of on the maybe sort of the encoding side of the workflow, something that can be quite useful that we're seeing a lot of interest in from sports streaming services, particularly, is cloud-based encoding. And one of the reasons for that is not just related to latency, but sports events, the demand for infrastructure can be quite peaky, right? Like if you take something like Formula One, there's not a Formula One race every single weekend. There's lots of interesting content that comes out between the races, but the peak in demand is probably during the race weekends, and they're not happening every single day. So you've got downtime there where viewership is a bit lower, but then it needs to scale up very quickly around those race weekends. And I think all sports are like that. You know, Premier League football matches are typically at the weekend or one or two during the week, for example. And so being able to scale quickly using cloud infrastructure can help to optimize and manage cost. So you don't have a big kind of hardware outlay, but maybe you can use some of that saving on the live streaming side to deliver a lower latency stream and spend the infrastructure cost there rather than maintaining a lot of hardware when it's not needed. Instead, engage with cloud technologies and cloud infrastructure to scale up when you really need that capacity.
Are there, so just thinking like the opportunity to be interactive and stuff, which is like if we're, if we're living in the metaverse, which I'm sure is going to happen any day now, there is this sort of this promise of loads of rich content that you're going to be able to interact with. A bunch of people are going to be able to interact with instantaneously, but even if it's not like some game type of setup, we want to be able to, broadcasters, rights holders want to be able to offer more interactive features with their content and different types of OTT content. I guess what has been learned from sort of the gaming industry and interactive content in terms of being able to provide like low latency interactive experiences, and how is that developing, or how is that going to develop? Is the technology we currently have pretty much we just keep doing that, or do you have to start to really rethink how you do stuff when you start adding other interactive features on top of video?
Well, one thing the gaming audience, and this builds off a point that James made, doesn't have to deal with is millions of people expecting instantaneous reactions to millions of other people. So the scale is a little different. Much like this video conference can be done with WebRTC, you can have direct connections between the players. It's possible. It scales that way. But optimizing for latency and interactivity isn't. There are lots of factors in it. Like there's this classic story about when one of the chat AI services was developed. People would type in their queries and instantly it would bang up a page of text, and people were like, "Oh, I don't like that. That was too fast." So they actually put a delay thinking and then play out the text as if somebody's kind of typing, but it's a lot faster than anyone could type. So it's much more about tying into what the user expects than it is getting the absolute best, fastest latency. So the gaming industry can predict things. They can say, I think this is going to happen next, and optimize the experience through that, as opposed to minimizing the latency between the players to the absolute minimum theoretical possible speed of light. So I guess I'm just, saying that the experience of latency isn't always about making it as minimal as possible. It's really more about tying into to optimizing the user experience and what people expect.
Yeah, would totally agree. I mean, if you think about the overlap between kind of gaming and sports, like fantasy sports is one of the extremely popular activities and games that people play alongside sports events. Typically, the data side could be like a data overlay. It could be data about your current fantasy team score. That's typically moving faster than the video is. So actually, in some cases, you may need to kind of slow down that data feed a little bit, or certainly understand from the viewer's device and video player what time they're actually seeing, sort of in terms of the real world. So you can align this kind of data update. This player has scored a goal and that's increased your fantasy points. Fantastic. You want to see that after you've seen the goal in the video, for example. So I think aligning those experiences is definitely something that needs to be thought through. So it is, I think Ian's right about this. It's really like, what user experience are you looking to provide? I think thinking about gaming particularly and touching on the predictive element that you brought up, Ian, is interesting. I think we have seen a few developments in the sort of codec space and like encoding research whereby potentially there's some advantage to be gained by generative AI kind of predicting sort of some small areas of content in the scene. Not as easy as in the gaming world where things are a little bit more predictable than what we might be able to predict someone's going to do in a sports event, for example. But I think it's interesting to think about whether technologies like that could an AI actually generate some of the content on the device side so that less has to be transmitted and encoded? Can that actually help to save some bandwidth? I think as a consumer, if I knew I was watching a football match where some of the actual event was generated by AI, I don't know why I would think about that, but it's an interesting to think about that at a small scale. Obviously, we're not talking about generating the entire minute or two of action, but at a small scale of an individual scene. I think the other area that we see in gaming is that we're now seeing, I think, a bit more development of on the distribution side is technologies like multicast UDP delivery, multicast ABR technologies, those kind of things. There's some growth there. I think gaming makes good use of technologies like UDP for delivery. We're seeing a little bit more kind of growth of that and interest in that from a sustainability perspective as well as a latency perspective. And one thing about that kind of broadcast tower on the hill is that that's typically a multicast delivery. So there's the advantage that offers, and potentially there's an opportunity to do something with multicasts within streaming as well. We're just seeing that kind of emerging, I think, at the moment.
So a few questions that came out there. One is this idea that I guess that it's still finally about storytelling, and it's like, even if that's Grandpa, tell me a story. If Grandpa jumps in like a quarter second after I've finished the sentence, it's freaky. Don't do that, Grandpa. There's something dreadfully wrong. But if that pace of the storytelling and kind of how things are delivered, and when something is presented to you, and how something like that's obviously that's almost the essence of the whole thing of broadcast. Do we have are there any good studies that have done around how audiences interact with latency and what their preferences are and kind of how they feel about receiving things late or buffering issues and all that? I mean, there must be you would think there would be some good research done on that somewhere.
Well, I think James hit the nail on the head with people don't like discontinuity more so than they dislike latency. So you want all of the information that you're consuming to be synchronized somehow. And definitely there are technologies for doing that, where you embed a time code in everything and you make sure that it's all arriving at the same time, regardless of whether it's delayed, or all arriving to you in a perceptive capacity at the same time. So I don't know if there are specific studies on pace or what people expect, but definitely that consistency between everything you're receiving is highly important.
Yeah, I think more of the studies I've seen have been around startup times, to be honest. So yeah, certainly we know that consumers won't wait for content to start for more than sort of 3 seconds or so. And that differs depending on device, right? If I'm sitting down, turning on my smart TV, I'm sitting down to watch some content for 30 minutes to an hour or more, I'm if it takes slightly longer to start, it doesn't matter so much to me because I'm in it for the duration. If I am watching a clip on my phone and I've only got, 10 seconds, 15 seconds before I'm waiting for the train to arrive or whatever it is, then the startup time matters much more. And in particular worlds like news, for example, that's really important. I think in the world of news, being first to market with a news story is crucial to get the viewership. And that news story might include, yes, live broadcasts. It might also include user-generated content. It might include content submitted by reporters remotely, for example. So you're bringing together quite a few different pieces of source material, not necessarily just a news anchor, you know, in the live broadcast, but there's multiple pieces of material that need to come very quickly. So I think the combination of streaming and distribution technologies, like we have a Bitmovin, it goes hand in hand with to bring together the whole viewer experience with what Ian and Signiant are doing in terms of getting that content from where it is to where it needs to be as quickly as possible on the production side.
And yeah, I can as a as a member of the audience, I'm used to receiving text and texting instantaneously, or WhatsApp, happening, or on my laptop or whatever it is. That idea of there are certain rhythms to things that I'm used to things happening, getting certain bits of information instantaneously, and when they don't happen instantaneously, that seems like a shock, or something's broken, or something doesn't go. I'm not thinking about the difference between video versus receiving a tweet. If I'm just a regular person out there getting the feed of all this information. So, I think just kind of managing that and managing those expectations. And again, I guess managing that experience for people would seem to be really key.
Yeah, the idea that James brought up of applying AI to managing this is very interesting. And the thing that immediately came to mind when he started talking about that is short video services, where they're predicting what you're going to want to watch next and pre-caching the next video so that when you scroll off or scroll on, you're going to have an instantaneous experience. But it applies all over the place. Like, as we talked about buffering latency, are you encoding a pixel, are you encoding a scan line, are you encoding a frame, are you encoding a group of pictures? Typically, to encode something efficiently, like a group of pictures, you need that entire group of pictures, which implies you're going to have buffering latency of that amount of time. But with AI and predicting, oh, I think this is going to happen next, I would imagine that there are places where you can get more efficiency in an encoding pipeline without making things up, which I agree with James's assertion that people might not be happy with that experience. If I'm watching a football match and every kick of the ball is pre-generated somehow for me, because every time someone kicks a football, they know exactly how that behaves. But I think we probably will see, and as we all know, we are seeing huge changes as these large AI-based statistical models are applied to everyday things that you wouldn't have ever expected them to be applied to.
Well, and is there that that AI being applied to your behavior around how are you a fast clicker, or are you like, oh, okay, they seem to they seem to don't mind if it's if it's 5 seconds or 10 seconds, it seems like they can live with it. That you might be able to start collecting user data and be able to serve content to people in a way that might end up with savings, on the at scale. I wondered about also, I've done work, quite a bit of work around sustainability in the media industry, and with organizations like Greening is Streaming, which I think Bitmovin is. You have been a member of Greening is Streaming, have you?
Yeah, we're working on a project which Green Streaming are involved in around the EcoFlow project,
Sure, yeah.
which is one of the IBC Accelerator projects. I think Yeah, what definitely one interesting topic that we discuss is viewer preferences. So, and that may be um, different between different viewers in terms of what they prioritize, like you say, but it also may depend on the context in which somebody is watching something. Like if I've paid to rent the latest movie that I want to watch on my big screen TV, I might want to see that in the top, absolute best quality. But if I'm just watching some show in the background while I'm doing something like cooking or something like that, then, I don't necessarily need to see that in the absolute best quality. I think one interesting thing that we're looking at as part of the EcoFo project is the role of networks within sustainability. So we know that devices have a big role to play in terms of powering the screen, in terms of potentially screen brightness, potentially high dynamic range has an impact. For example, the environment of the room around you. But now we're kind of looking at the role of networks in sustainability. So, like I mentioned, seeing some growth in technologies like multicast or UDP delivery, is there a sustainability benefit there, which can help people at the networking level to avoid provisioning hardware for the peak load when there's only a live event kind of once per week, for example? How can that help there? I think what current research is showing, and I think this is still sort of work in progress, but current research is showing that more network communication isn't necessarily impacting energy consumption unless it kind of increases to the scale that new hardware needs to be visioned or new hardware needs to be added. So, for example, if I went for a low latency stream on my TV versus a standard latency stream, in terms of pure sort of network communication and device energy consumption, there's unlikely to be too much difference. But when you look at the infrastructure level, maybe there is something there to take a look at. So sustainability is definitely a factor, and I think different consumers in different contexts will have different approaches to how they want to experience that as well.
And then Ian, what about that in terms of sustainability, being able to manage that whole system and that whole pipeline of content delivery? I mean, are there things that people can be doing better or thinking about, um, adjusting as they're moving content through this workflow that are going to
It's
be
not
saving
necessarily
energy or?
specifically, yeah, it's not necessarily specifically a sustainability issue, but people are definitely focusing on how do I have less copies of the same
Mm-hmm.
content, and less copies of the same content obviously costs less and consumes less resources. So in that regard, we are implementing capabilities that allow people to come to the media as opposed to send the media to another location, and people to come to the media to interact with it in a way that is optimal to what they're trying to accomplish. So the social media clipping example again, instead of sending the original high-res content out to everybody's desktop in with specialized desktop tools that have high processing requirements, by feeding a stream to the person that they can watch in a web browser, allowing them to clip in that web browser. Those sorts of things can definitely reduce the overall environmental footprint of a social media clipping workflow, for example. So it's it obviously has much more effect when you're applying it on a broad consumer basis than when you're applying it in a post-production pipeline business. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some benefit and some effect that can be achieved in post-production type workflows.
There's that, somebody said that, that it's whenever you're moving anything, if it's a plane or a car or electrons, when you're moving something that's, try to avoid doing that. Um, that's really, really great. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think is particularly amazing around this subject? I mean, I guess maybe the future might be something to look at. Are we on the verge of any breakthroughs? I know I've heard a few things about some, some major international sporting events coming up where people are starting to say, that over the internet or OTT latency will be less than regular cable latency by the time some of these events roll up.
And there's no reason it can't be. It's all just a cost trade-off, right? And quite frankly, to the previous point, an environmental trade-off. So I think you'll definitely see that for premium content, where in particular there's interactivity, the betting scenarios that James has mentioned, the lots of community discussing as things are happening scenarios. But I think fundamentally the advantage that technology advances are going to be giving is being able to do it at a lower cost. It's not that you can't do these things now, it's just that there's significantly more cost to doing them at very low latency.
Yeah, I think I would concur with that. We're seeing more deployments of low latency technologies than we have in the past through things like low latency HLS and low latency Dash. I think something that's helping a little bit there is some of the older devices, which maybe struggle more with that technology, are also kind of moving out of consumers' homes as they're refreshing their TVs, for example. Getting more recent models is helpful. So that's kind of, one aspect that we see. I think also we're seeing, obviously, the world is seeing huge developments in terms of AI. I think we're seeing some application of that in, for example, live clipping workflows for highlights generation, potentially using AI there to clip relevant segments, or if somebody has already clipped a relevant segment, transforming that into different formats very, very quickly, for example, into vertical video. I think if we see a direction of travel whereby latencies are getting lower, the amount of time that a human has to make a production decision is reducing. Like if the consumer at home is seeing the event at a 30 seconds delay, I've got some time around up to 30 seconds to do something as a human in the process. Could be clipping a highlights package, could be selecting a highlights clip, for example. But if we see a direction of travel towards sub 5 second latency, that time window really, really reduces. So maybe humans need to be assisted by AI to do some clipping, or maybe they can say, okay, this is a really important highlight. I'll roughly kind of select the time range of it, but the AI is going to do the fine-grained time code selection and maybe convert it into a vertical video for social that gets pushed out straight away, that kind of thing. So there may be a need for more automation and faster movement of files around to align with potentially faster or lower latencies for consumers at home. So I think that's where AI can play a role. And we talked about kind of prediction earlier and recommendation. That's an area where AI is very applicable.
Amazing. Well, Ian and James, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us in the inaugural feed forum. And you at home, at whatever time you're watching this, join us for more. There will be more feed forums to come, feed fora to come. And I really look forward to seeing you here and hearing what you have to say about our topics here at Feed Forum. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Thanks, Neal.
Thank you.
James. Bye now.
Thanks.